Thrilled to introduce our neighbor and colleague Raffaele Bedarida, who is a professor at the Cooper Union just a few blocks away. Raffaele is an art historian, and he got his PhD in art history from CUNY, the Graduate Center, and he holds an MA and a BA in art history from the Università degli Studi di Siena. Raffaele specializes particularly in inter-Atlantic exchanges between Europe and America, cultural diplomacy, art and politics. He has published on a range of subjects, particularly on Italian modernism and everything from futurism to arte povera in an international context. He's lectured at the Guggenheim Museum, at MoMA, and he joined the full-time faculty at the Cooper Union in 2016. His recent publications include a book on Corrado Cagli, an incredibly interesting figure, as well as some upcoming research which he's going to present to us today. So please join me in welcoming Raffaele Bedarida.
Thank you, Ara, and thank you all for being here. This is what I'm going to present today is part of a conversation and research that I've had with our historian Sharon Hacker. That's why I'm including her as a co-author. She's in Milan right now, but she gave me permission to share our research. Which we are currently expanding into an edited book project. So whenever I say we, I mean Sharon and I. I will be very grateful for any feedback, thoughts, doubts, comments at the end. The project was born out of our respective reactions to the exhibition post Zang Tumb Tuum held at the Fondazione Prada in Milan last April. Here you see an installation view and a poster promoting the event. Like many visitors, we both found the show and its Prada venue to be beautiful. The works were aesthetically stunning, and the installation of the works was impeccable. But unlike many visitors, we found the exhibition unsettling. Sharon and I began a critical discussion about our mutual discomfort about the exhibition's beauty. We could not get beyond the fact that it was that very same beauty and seduction, the idea of the desirability of fascist art, that contributed to fascism's political success in the first place. Additionally, we questioned the show's refusal to address the traumatic experience of living under Mussolini's regime. Over the next months, our dialogue expanded about what the exhibition showed and what it concealed, and how this show fit into a broader post-war history of exhibitions of fascist art in Italy. The fascist past is an especially significant case study for a critical history of exhibitions in general, for two main reasons. One is that the fascist past still functions today as the ultimate historical paradigm. In Italy, but not only in Italy, a model against which we collectively define the present at every level, from bar conversation to the academic context and everywhere in between. The fact that the Prada show opened the day before Italy's political elections in February 2018 made the use or misuse of the fascist past all the more apparent. The second reason, this is more about the exhibition history practices. The fascist regime simultaneously promoted a religious-like celebration of aesthetic autonomy, but also the propaganda power of collective rituals, among which art exhibitions featured prominently, and it mastered these two forms. Germano Celant described the Prada exhibit as, quote-unquote, showing the showing. And indeed, he mapped a wide range of exhibition strategies of Mussolini's regime. And we can see that at the two poles where the temples of aesthetic autonomy, such as the Biennales of the 1930s, and here you see this is how the Venice Biennale of 1932 was presented in the Prada show. So on the one hand, that kind of aesthetic autonomy presented in the context of the Biennale. And on the other pole, the politicized avant-garde spaces such as the Mostra della Rivoluzione Fascista of 1932, a very famous and influential show I will go back to later, in which boundaries of art, life, and politics were blurred. And here on the right, you see how that exhibition was presented at the Prada Foundation. Like previous shows on fascism, the Prada exhibit raised questions such as, does showing mean reiterating or celebrating the original model? How much of the interpretive tool of scholarship can be translated into an exhibition without falling into the trap of didacticism? Does interpreting the past mean judging it moralistically? How much agency does the public get? These questions are especially charged, both politically and ethically, when we deal with the brutal regime, such as the fascist one. But they are relevant to any effort to exhibit a historical moment. The privately funded Prada exhibition took its title from Marinetti's onomopoetic 1914 book, Zang Tumb Tuum, about the Battle of Adrianople, which was an ode to belligerence, and you see it here reproduced tiny. Behind the scenes, we heard that the title had changed in the last minute. It was supposed to be Lo Stato dell'Arte, the state of the art. This enormous show included over 600 works by over 100 artists and a myriad of documents. It included works by fascist supporters, such as Sironi, and opponents, or sort of opponents, such as Guttuso and others. It includes masterpieces and lesser-known works. The show was organized chronologically, but not chronologically per artwork. It was chronologically per exhibition. So in 1918, you could have a work of art from 1913, but the 1918 room would exhibit a show from the year 1918. But it was the most prominent visual feature of the show was the theatrical, partially reconstructed spaces. For example, the home of Marinetti, which here you see in these photographs, which was used in the catalog and for the posters. We have a performance by Marinetti in his living room in which the artwork, the original artwork by Boccioni, is reproduced in color. I'll go back to this process of altering original documents. On the right hand, you see a photo shot in which you can see how the Boccioni work is exhibited just opposed to this work by Tullio d'Albisola, which also appears in the photo. So there is this kind of an allusion in the actual show to the specific photograph, which is also exhibited in the work. So you could have that kind of exhibition space, but also, for example, the Universal Exposition planned to be in Rome in 1942. And you see that models were used, the photographs, so different modes of reproduction. Venice Biennales, as we saw earlier, Rome Quadriennales, and again, the widely popular 1932 Mostra della Rivoluzione Fascista. Here you can see on the left, this is a photograph of one of the main rooms in the original 1932 show in Rome. And on the right, again, is a photo of how it was presented at the Prada Foundation. The 1932 show was evoked in a warehouse area with the screens projecting photos from the exhibition. Almost no attention was devoted to the human realities of life under Mussolini's regime, nor was a critical viewpoint or interpretation put forward by the curator, implying a sort of critical neutrality, and I'll go back to this term of neutrality and what it can mean later on. So this idea of neutrality, which left open for the public to judge. The initial response by the press was overwhelmingly positive. When Sharon and I started talking about the show, we were quite shocked by the celebrative pieces that appeared in the international press immediately after the opening. For example, the New York Times and Financial Times here in the United States, or La Repubblica and Domus in Italy, just to name a few. Reviewers mostly appreciated two things, which is also what Celant and the Prada Foundation emphasized. One was the massive use of documentary materials, especially the transformation of archival photographs into immersive environments. So in this case, for example, the original photo is turned into a real life-size environment, and then some of the actual works are inserted where they originally were. So this is one of the things that the press appreciated. And the second thing is that the show avoided the modernist framework of the white cube and contextualized the artworks within the complexity of real life, or to use the exhibition subtitle, Art, Life, Politics. And here I'm giving again the example with Boccioni. You can go to MoMA and see a dynamism of a soccer player in the room dedicated to futurism, right? So within a genealogy or a history of artistic movements or stylistic evolution, or however you want to see it, but still in a white ahistorical space. Celant claimed that this exhibition was bringing back the work in a real-life context, such as the living room of Marinetti in Rome, and how it was utilized in that context. Then a few critical responses emerged. Curator Rosalie McKeever, writing in an online magazine, Apollo, subtly pointed to a, quote, utopian but depopulated vision, end of quote, and noted how the unsettling sleekness of the exhibition theater mimicked the fascist display aesthetic. Art historian Esther Cohen published an uncompromising j'accuse in the popular Italian website Dagospia. This was an especially significant one for us because Cohen is one of the many scholars who contributed essays in the monumental and scholarly exhibition catalog. But then, after seeing the show, she rejected it as uncritical. Cohen saw the Prada exhibit as a show of great art, far from Celant's claim of a real and contextual history. So here you see on the left Cohen's, a piece of Cohen's article. On the right is Celant's essay in the catalog, in which he claims that this way of contextualizing work is bringing it back to a real and contextual moment. In Cohen's view, not only did the exhibit fail to present the reality of violence and oppression under fascism, but it actually covered that reality behind an aesthetically pleasing veil of fine art. It is useful to think about curatorial practices in the context of these responses. Celant indicated to several interviewers that, quote, the show curated itself, end of quote. This is a strong statement whose meaning Sharon and I have been thinking about quite a bit. This idea seems to create a show that is open-ended, in which the curator should mostrare and non dimostrare. This is a term I will go back to, the idea of showing without demonstrating, exhibit without judging. This brings up the question of philology as a method of scholarship, but also as a way of curating exhibitions in Italy, so both in curatorial practice and in academia. We asked ourselves, what kind of understanding of history does exhibiting documentary materials create? What does the concept of a show that curates itself say about the role and intellectual responsibility of a curator? As in any exhibition, there were very specific methodological and curatorial choices made here, of course, from the choice of chronology, including a selected temporal cutoff, to the choices of how many and which artworks to include and which to exclude, or which exhibitions to include and which to exclude, to the choice to use reconstructions and how to make this visible, which were actually partial reconstructions rather than full mise-en-scène, to backdrops and wall colors, font types, what kind of text, if at all, was put on the labels, placement, juxtaposition of art objects, and even choices of lighting. Of course, each one of that is an editing or curatorial choice. The venue itself, the privately owned Prada Foundation, was loaded with meaning. Any space would be loaded with meaning. From the foundation's well-known fashion brand to its architecture and mission. Additionally, while refraining from offering a clear narrative could be useful to someone with a serious intellectual background of the period and the tools with which to interpret the work, it is unclear to us where such a curatorial practice left the average viewers to the show, the general public or the young observer who comes to the show to learn about fascism for the first time. Mediation with various kinds of audiences seems to be all but absent. And in particular, we were thinking about Holocaust museums all over the world have been working on methods of pedagogy on how to make difficult, delicate, problematic materials accessible to the public of various ages, and all of that was not in the show. Because of most of these questions are not new. So we started, we want to think about the show in the broader context of the history of curating shows on fascism. And in particular, two previous exhibits are the most direct precedents for the Prada show. One is Arte Moderna in Italia, 1915 to 1935, organized by Carlo Ludovico Ragghianti at Palazzo Strozzi in Florence. This was in 1967. You see the catalog cover. This is the entrance. I'm showing you other rooms later. Which was a first reflection in Italy on a period that was still largely taboo. The other is Anni Trenta, Arte e Cultura in Italia, organized by Renato Barilli and a team of collaborators at Palazzo Reale and other sites in Milan in 1982, which spectacularized the past and replicated some curatorial strategies of the fascist period with a degree of euphoria, if not nostalgia. Here you see the sketches and also an installation view of a room designed by Luciano Baldassarri for the fascist-sponsored Esposizione dell'Aeronautica Italiana. This is the room dedicated to aviation and fascism. And of course, the 1982 show mimic that specifically, or in general, the fascist reinterpretation of the triumphal arch, the classical triumphal arch model. Although these two, so the 1967 and the 1982 show, are not at all the only shows dedicated to the art of the fascist period, they are comparable to the 2018 show for their monumental size, large number of visitors, and their ability to generate discussion on the fascist past among scholars and the general public alike. They also introduced some strategies used by Celant. Now, today, for time limits, I will mostly focus on the 1967 show, but later I'll be happy to discuss the 1982 show as well for the Q&A. So I mentioned already the term mostrare and non dimostrare. The original, the person who actually used it first was Ragghianti. He used this phrase in 1967 as a key strategy through which he dealt with a recent and burning past, yet avoiding predictable forms of rejection or condemnation. By doing so, Ragghianti claimed he distanced himself from the ultimate fascist curator, which he identified with Margherita Sarfatti. Sarfatti, according to Ragghianti, allegedly said that the 1932 show Mostra della Rivoluzione Fascista did not exhibit the fascist revolution, it demonstrated it. In other words, Ragghianti saw formalists and apolitical open-endedness as an antidote to fascist propaganda, which overdetermines and prescribes meaning to its public. Forgetting that fascist biennales promoted non-political art in wide cube context, or the closest you could get in the 1930s. Here I'm showing you a biennale and a quadriennale for the 1930s. Their paintings and sculptures were presented as objects of aesthetic contemplation, of pure aesthetic contemplation. Like Celant, Ragghianti amassed in his show all sorts of artists from a variety of stylistic groups, as you can see in these two photo shots. He identified artistic quality as the only method of selection, and also with various relationships with the regime, but he deliberately avoided any discussion of those relationships or the link between the type of art and the politics. Ragghianti anticipated Celant in his installation too. he curated small stages or theatrical backdrops, as you can see here, and installed some artworks within and others outside of the frames for no apparent reason other than aesthetic choice. The effect, not unlike the Prada Foundation, was a constant shift of curatorial register, which framed the act of exhibiting. It functioned as quotation marks with a distancing effect. It reminded me of the effect that some painting of Francis Bacon of the late 60s and 1970s have. The Prada artworks, like the expressive bodies in Bacon's painting, are confined and compressed through multiple framing structures. The effect is particularly strong with the sculptural objects like Arturo Martini's Aviatore here on the right, whose theatricality is potentiated by the contrast between color and black and white, and between photographed shadows and actual shadows. And another important thing is that photography was not allowed in the galleries of the Prada Foundation. So the only photographs that are available were provided by the foundation itself. So each one of these images is very well crafted and controlled by the institution. Like the Prada show, the 1967 Ragghianti show had a similar claim of neutrality. As the curator of the first major show after the end of fascism to deal with that period, Ragghianti declared his method explicitly as a way for someone who had experienced the regime. He was an anti-fascist activist and was imprisoned for that, to reconsider that past after 20 years from a more detached and nuanced viewpoint. Celant, on the contrary, does not situate his position in relation to his method or his objects of inquiry. Based on this historical contextualization, Sharon and I began to formulate such questions as, can there be a neutrality in an exhibition? Is the emphasis placed on neutrality historically determined? And at what point does neutrality become irresponsibility, especially when approaching such a historically delicate topic? This same idea was positively termed in the case of Ragghianti in 1967 as puro visibilità, as a focus on the purely aesthetic qualities of a work of art. And in fact, one comment that we overheard at the opening at Prada was between two elderly women who commented quite nostalgically to each other, quote, yes, what a beautiful period it was, if not for that stain of fascism, end of quote. Another visitor, when Sharon pressed her about the absence of the negative aspects of the period, remarked that, quote, of course, Celant could have also created a chamber of horrors to make this show realistic, but it would have ruined the beauty of the installation, end of quote. So the risk of beautifying, distancing, rendering the realities of the period indifferent are, in this case, quite palpable. And when thinking about neutrality, we might also consider the historical moment in which the show opened, as I mentioned earlier, just before last year's elections in Italy, and more in general, in a moment in which right-wing populism is becoming more and more stronger and stronger. In his catalog essay, Celant rejected the white cube, allegedly, because he sees it as a tool which isolates the work of art from its context and turns it into a commodifiable object. In other words, he resumed the rhetoric of the critica a critica, a critical criticism of his early Arte Povera moment, which he developed right after the Ragghianti show, starting in the late 60s and early 70s, which was also a period, by the way, in which Celant was looking at Francis Bacon a lot. So, for example, the book, this one, Arte Povera from 1969, Celant claimed that the photographs in it are published in the same order he received them from the artist as an exercise of transparency, again, of neutrality. Paradoxically, in the late 60s, Celant opposed Ragghianti's Crocean approach, inspired by Benedetto Croce, but ultimately reached similar conclusions as Ragghianti. Imbued with 1968 rhetoric, Celant rejected interpretation as an incrustation of meaning and a form of authority. He embraced transparency as a curatorial method and a countercultural tool. But we wondered, what is the function of his guerrilla-like claim against the market or commodifying art 50 years later, especially in the branded spaces of the Prada Foundation? Plus, how do we situate Celant's claim of transparency or neutrality in the show where archival documents are systematically photoshopped and manipulated? The juxtaposition of black and white photos and the artwork in color, for one, introduces a strong editorial gaze. It potentiates the sense of documentary authenticity of the primary source and charges the reenactment of the past emotionally. In a way, it is comparable at one level with the girl with the red coat in Steven Spielberg's Schindler's List. The interpretation that Spielberg and Celant gave of the same historical moment couldn't be more different. Spielberg focuses on the atrocities of concentration camps and uses black and white, in his word, quote, to remain true to the spirit of documentaries and steals from the period, end of quote. Celant, on the other hand, avoids explicitly that, exactly that, sorry, and brings us into lofty living rooms, as we saw of Marinetti, and Biennale galleries. But they equally utilized the induced authority of documentary truth to interpret a historical moment in ways that are all but neutral. As a result of the alterations of historical sources, the work in the Prada show function less as autonomous objects than as indexical references to situations and people from the period. For example, in this photo of the room dedicated to 1942, you see again Arturo Martini's work. So his sculptures are reinstalled as they were in the 1942 Venice Biennale. So you can see, you as a viewer at the Prada Foundation, can see them as the Nazi prime minister, the Nazi minister of propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, did when he visited, as emphasized in one of the photoshopped photographs reproduced in the catalog. So in a way, the exhibition becomes a reenactment of history. Celant used the works in post-Zang Tumb Tuum to reflect back our act of looking, see ourselves impersonate Goebbels, Mussolini, and more generally, the interwar Italian public. We could realize this was the same public that saw and caused the collapse of parliamentarism, the fascist power grab, the enactment of the racial laws all the way to the ultimate disaster of World War II. However, the relationship between those two modes of spectatorship were not addressed. What is the relationship between the two? So questions of on spectatorship were not addressed directly by the curator, but so if we read the show as a question mark, and this is why now we are working on this, this book project, we can find important avenues for new research. So I would like to conclude, I want to show some moments in the exhibition that we found particularly significant to then open up the discussion. This was a room dedicated to the year 1926, and in the vitrine here, and here is a larger view, you have some of the publications by Margherita Sarfatti. In particular, there is one, her book on Mussolini, Dux, which you see here, just a part of it. The cover reproduces Adolfo Dill's sculpture, portrait of Mussolini. So Celant decided to have the original sculpture reproduced just above, but then as the public went and looked at the documentary material, found it, you would find yourself in this weird position of bowing down in front of Mussolini's portrait. Another revelation to me was this photograph from the 1932 show, the Mostra della Rivoluzione Fascista. In that exhibition, which narrated the triumph of the fascist revolution, the March on Rome, there were also reconstruction of historical moments. So one of them was a reconstruction of the room of Mussolini's office at the newspaper Il Popolo d'Italia. So it's interesting. It functioned almost like a mise en abîme for the Prada show, in the sense that it showed how the regime originally mastered Celant's strategy, namely the spectacularization of a historical narrative through carefully selected and manipulated documents. So again, all of this is true, but where does it lead you? Another difficult room for me was the room dedicated to 1938, in which the artworks exhibited at the Venice Biennale of 1938 were displayed, but there was no presence whatsoever of the leggi razziali, the anti-Semitic laws that made it impossible for Jews to work and for artists to exhibit. So in an exhibition that is entitled Life, Politics, Art, where is that life experience? And then the final room was a kind of hybrid. It was almost the end of the show. And in the middle of the room, there was this large table with many, many books that visitors could flip through. And allegedly, these were the books used by the curator and the curatorial team to research and prepare for the exhibition. This was the only room in which the presence of the Holocaust was acknowledged. And one of them was a drawing by Corrado Cagli, who was a Jewish artist who left Italy in 1939 after the racial laws, came to the United States, and then participated in the liberation of the concentration camps with the American army. So this work was there, but was tiny, and the public at that point was exhausted. The room was outside of the narrative of the historical progression of the show, and more importantly, everybody at this point was looking towards the center of the room, flipping through the books. So those very few images of the Holocaust were just left kind of mute. So thank you, and I'll take questions. No, there was no. Yeah.
I mean, is he aware that there's any sort of dialogue going on, or?
I'm sure he is, but yeah, he has not acknowledged, as far as I know. But I've been following the reception history of this show quite a bit. So yes, I don't think so. Yes.
Oh gosh, what do I want to say? Do you think another way to do it, or a better way to do it, like, because you mentioned, I saw your talk last week about Cagli, and and you were talking about the gallery in New York, the Cometa Gallery, and they were promoting Jewish artists until 1938, and then all of a sudden, no, right? So instead of having just a contextual thing where you're showing a replica of the exhibition, if you were showing a parallel thing of 1938, like that, like how they were promoting.
Yeah, that's a great question, and of course, it's not an easy way, right, to curate a moment, especially with all of the contradictions and ambiguities of the fascist regime. What I think would be and all this said, I believe that Celant is an amazing curator. I mean, he was able to really I mean, we are talking about this show because he was really able to touch something that is hot, right? This said, I think that the main thing that would make a curatorial approach on this more effective is placing yourself in relation to that historical past. So I don't have a recipe for a kind of general way through which that moment should be represented. But for example, when we were talking about Cagli, as an artist who went through this kind of trajectory from being commissioned work by the fascist regime to being an exile to be a soldier in the American army, when he went back in Italy, he was exhibiting
everything.
And that's why it was so controversial, because he was presenting himself as gay, as a former fascist, as Jewish, as an American soldier. All of that was there, and so he presented his own subjective experience in relation to the past. Now, and that's why, for example, I was saying Ragghianti, although had to a certain degree similar solutions to the way the fascist period was presented, I think that his choice was, he made that choice part of his way of experience, or his way of looking back to the
autobiography.
So in this moment, I think we should acknowledge where are we and what does it mean for us to look back, so the idea of the document that is there as objective.
As the only way, right?
Yeah.
Did you see the show at the Neue Gallery about the Degenerate Art Exhibit?
Right.
Exhibit?
And it is part of the same phenomenon, right? So this is like a much bigger thing that is happening. Of course, wonder why the exhibitions dedicated to fascism become more and more interesting in this moment.
Because the one thing that I thought was interesting about that show is that I'm very cynical, but at that show they amped up the security. So there were long lines to get into the show.
Right.
So I was looking at that and saying, oh yeah, they want to replicate the long lines that got into the Munich show in 1938. But anyway, that's that's me.
Yeah, for example, I found a very effective, a viable curatorial approach, the show that Ken Silver curated at the Guggenheim, Chaos and Classicism, to complicate some of the assumptions about the relationship between stylistic and modes of representation and political affiliation. I think that another important thing is that I briefly mentioned the pedagogy in relation to. For example, I was expecting very often like what an institution organizes for children is very telling of does the institution or the exhibition know what they want to convey, or and there was none at the very
Thanks, Raf. It's an important and interesting project, and I just have a few questions. And as you know, I reviewed it for Frieze, and I was wholly uncritical, and so I feel chagrined to the extent that I was not attuned to some of its failings. But that said, I guess a few questions.
But
one,
you talked about going through the streets, right? The Balilla Street and the Park of the Resistance, right?
Yeah.
And which contextualizes, right, the present.
And I guess just a few sort of contextual things. One, there was this show at the Palazzo Strozzi in Florence about now 5 or 6 years ago called Art Beyond Fascism. And that was, for me, that show was infinitely more problematic to the extent that it proposed an excision of the works from their historical matrix. The whole proposal of the show was, can we look at art from the 30s in Italy, in the 20s and 30s, without really even necessarily thinking about their social and historical context? That was an aggressive kind of willful proposal of ripping things out of their historical and social context. I I guess, and one thing that's interesting, and I'm sure you guys will be thinking about this for the volume, is this Predappio Museum of Mussolini's childhood home, which is now becoming, if it's not yet ready, a museum.
It's not ready.
It's not ready, yeah. And of course, the difference is that in Austria, Hitler's childhood home has now been slated for demolition because the notion that it would be a site of pilgrimage and honor, even in a historical sense, is anathema in Germany, whereas in Italy now Mussolini's home is, and in Predappio itself you can see souvenirs not only of, I think, kind of neo-fascist affiliation, but also historically fascist paraphernalia. But I guess my two questions are this, or 1 point and then one question. One, I would push back. I remember seeing Schindler's List in college and thinking that it had zero alienation effect to it, and had
zero alienation?
Alienation effect. That it had no, that it wanted the cachet of documentary while being still a wholly Hollywood movie. That's not to say that it wasn't without its horrors, but I wouldn't necessarily hold up Schindler's List as the kind of aesthetic, realist counterpoint to in that instance. I mean, I think it has its own problems in terms of how one sublimates history into entertainment in a different way. But I guess my main question is, if there isn't a chamber of horror, and one thing you forgot to mention is that on the second floor there was an entire room of Aligi Sassoon, Maffei, other painters of the 30s who were very much pushing back against, right? Mino Maccari, who had post having turned against the regime. So it wasn't just the Cagli, right? There was a little bit of kind of Guttuso and others. But I guess my main question is how would one, and I would ask the same question of Esther, what curatorial solutions would you pose to allowing us to sort of think about the historical context? Because there are other shows that were equally, I mean, the big show in Forlì 5 years ago was the same, similar. It wasn't as seductive as the Celant, and I agree that the Celant was, I mean, in the hall that recreated the the Mostra della Rivoluzione Fascista was perhaps the apex of the show's kind of almost disingenuous reproduction, restaging, rather than a critical history. But what sorts of things would you have liked to see?
All right. So there is a lot of questions here. So I think that about your comments on Schindler's List, I agree with you. I mean, I think that was my point. That in both cases, the documentary material is utilized to create a sense of rigor and reliability, but ultimately the intended effect is a dramatization and this kind of emotion. Of course, I was saying the interpretation of the moment is very different, and so I think that Celant is completely overlooking or denying in the show the presence of the Shoah, whereas of course Spielberg didn't. But I think. On that point, I agree with you. I mentioned Cagli as one of that room as one of the very few moments when the Holocaust is represented. Not artists who were not aligned or critical. But again, you have, a
set of tools to understand.
You have Guttuso, right, or you have Aligi Sassu, and you bring your contextual knowledge, and so you can read through. But otherwise, the show did not provide that. So why are these artists here? And what does this work represent in terms of how, for example, consensus is constructed, modes of exhibition? So that's the thing. Compared to the other exhibitions that you mentioned, Challenge Show was much more successful and reached a much wider audience, in part because it replicated the spectacle that fascist shows had. So the ability to turn any passage being anti-fascist activism or total complacency with the ideology of the regime, everything is flattened into this. And that's why I was disturbed, because I loved the show. I mean, I was there. I had pleasure visiting that show, despite everything I was telling myself. Right. So that's what I found disturbing. Curatorial solution. I think that's something I. Yes.
Yeah, well, one curatorial solution would have been, I think, to have used certain moments in the show, to use a cliche, as teaching moments.
But one of the more insidious, I personally think it's a very lazy thing to do, simply to reconstruct previous exhibitions. But one of the more insidious parts of what you've just shown is that the show proceeds chronologically, just like the Mostra della Rivoluzione Fascista did, right? And then you have this culminating moment with that installation devoted to a mass propaganda exhibition, which is very different from art exhibitions. There is no autonomy, because all the fine art exhibitions are also being politically utilized. So he builds up. It's interesting that the show insidiously replicates that model of year by year, right? That's what happens in the Mostra. If you look at it, it's done by years with documents. He could have, when we reached, you mentioned the Holocaust, but already when we reached 1935-36, he could have used the Martini Sculpture with the imagery of the, fammi ricordare, quella scultura di Martini, which is a response, triumphal response to the Blini the memorial to Bligny, with the man coming out of the grave,
Yeah.
an Italian soldier who was lost. So he could have suddenly, in a kind of Brechtian way, to use an analogy, he could have interrupted this placid year by year to suddenly this moment where there is a brutal reality in which many of these artists participated triumphantly, including Fontana, right? Because you also mentioned that there was no... So that was one way he could have done it, and then that could have been followed also by a room of artists who had been persecuted, namely Jewish ones, not to mention material that could have been used for the Holocaust. So he could have actually driven it, seduced the spectator in the same way that the original Mostra actually did, but he didn't do that. You had mentioned that the show didn't express the traumatic experience of living under the fascist regime. And there I think we have to be careful, because for the first, there was trauma obviously during the rise to power. We have to be careful of the word trauma as well. But most people were quite content in Italy, right? For the first decade. So it was,
some of them.
well, the majority. You can read several historians on this. And we know the history of so-called resistance fighters who became resistance fighters at certain convenient moments. So reality hits after 33 and then 35 and 38. But the everyday experience of many people throughout the decade was, in fact, not traumatic. And that's an even more insidious fact that isn't... people were quite complacent, as they are today. Their daily lives were not disturbed.
Maybe in Italy, but just, for example, the title, Post Zang Tumb Tuum, the bombing of Libya, that precedes fascism, but it reminded me, the Pero's tapestry, Guerra Festa, the idea of turning war into this party. Post Zang Tumb Tuum is like...
I couldn't agree more, but I'm simply saying the daily life of... And though that trauma was inflicted on the Ethiopians and on the Libyans, which in no way, there was no bombing videos in this, right? There was no mention of Italians in prison camps because they avoided the Second World War disaster. In fact, they could have also included that. So I think there were many obvious ways curatorially.
Right.
And also, you raised so many interesting questions, Raffaele. It's really good to think about all the things that you raised. And another thing that you said that was quite interesting was the risk of over-didacticism. But, maybe certain shows there is no such risk. Maybe didacticism is not a bad thing.
Yeah, and it can manifest. For example, there was a conference organized in concomitance with the show, and Salvatore Settis participated, Claire Bishop, and they talked about other things. There was no discussion about fascism. They're not authority. They were invited to discuss exhibition curatorial practices. And that's another important thing, the kind of authorial voice behind that. And one thing I did, I think that right there is this kind of identification Celant Marinetti that is still playing out.
I was just saying, I agree with everything Mimi said. I guess my point is that because it's the Prada and because it's Celant, maybe that invites more scrutiny to the extent that, when I think of the Forlì show, when I think of the, the 30s Beyond Fascism, or even, the Guggenheim Futurism show, there was no contextualization there of Idol Pittura and its relationship to, unless I'm mistaken, there wasn't references to colonialism or to the war on the walls, right? I guess my point is that if we're going to single out this show, then we would have to apply the same criteria to these others for somehow sidestepping historical material as well.
I don't agree completely about the futurist show, in the sense that there was video materials and wall text and plus a very strong educational activity. I mean, educators at the Guggenheim went through a whole training on how to talk about the colonial past and fascism. So all of that, it doesn't have to be on the walls. What I'm saying is an exhibition can live in many ways. It can be an audio guide. It could be...
I'm just saying that the Celant show was not alone in its
No,
transgression.
no, of course. But this kind of universal enthusiasm for how great this was, that's what I found. And of course, you're right. It's wrong to just point the finger. The other thing is, exhibiting in Italy, there are so many spaces that are historically charged, and so that's another thing to consider. How do you place those objects? So of course the Prada, it's too easy to say Prada fashion and glamour and blah blah blah, but it's also a choice for someone like Celant who could, I mean, he has a direct role in that foundation, but he could have done the show in many other spaces, right?
I also know on authority that it was Prada who insisted upon
On the title, I know.
So
I know, but if Prada chooses the title, that's the title. I mean, that's the
that's what she said.
yeah.
Maybe we have time for a couple more questions.
I think an exhibition such as the one we saw contributes to the acceptance or the neutralization of fascism. Context is everything. If you remember, Diego Rivera was painting a mural in Washington, D.C. Rockefeller didn't think that it was neutral. He opposed it because it had a small picture of Lenin, and he insisted it be eliminated. And it was a fight between two ideologies. And of course, he won. Rockefeller won. It was in Washington, D.C.
Rockefeller Center.
I thought it was, sorry for that. I think that sanitizing and trying to this acceptance of neutrality, of painting the fascist epic as beautiful, or the art of that epic as beautiful, contributes to a kind of passivity and acceptance of the fascist ideology. Statues of known fascists have been erected in towns and villages in Italy. Have they been torn down? Where is the opposition? This is a very troubling moment in history, and I think not standing up to this sort of neutralization of fascism is only encouraging it to grow again.
Thank you. I didn't mention that the show had a big afterlife online. So Casa Pound and other alt-right movements, hashtags on the exhibitions and quotations from Mussolini were quite ubiquitous after the opening. So it kind of relate to what you were saying.
One last one?
Yeah, one last one.
Sorry, I suppose this is more a cultural question, but do you believe that the cultural denial, I suppose, in Italy of, say, like its fascist past contributes to this, or that the exhibitions like this directly sort of create this amnesia, I suppose, culturally in Italy of the horrors of fascism, and, as opposed to, say, like a country like Germany or other countries?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, I think an exhibition like this has a strong responsibility. Scholarship has done a lot in Italy too. I mean, there are major scholars and important books for decades now that have discussed, the role of state patronage and spectatorship and the system of the arts to construct ideology and consensus. And the interesting thing is some of the authors who have contributed to this discourse were invited to be in the catalog, but then there is a disconnect between what happens in the catalog and what happens in the exhibition. I think that the exhibition, because there are many things, right, that happen in how the political consciousness is constructed collectively, and so the two poles of working on having a strong awareness or memory or sense of responsibility in Italy for what is the fascist past, and on the other hand, this kind of neutralization. I would say, this exhibition worked in that direction.
Please join me